Good morning, distinguished delegates, colleagues from the agencies, colleagues from other corners of the UN system. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's 9:51, so we will aim at starting at 10 sharp. The president is joining us in a few minutes. The bureau just finished. If I can ask your indulgence in please renaming yourselves in capital letters, the country that you're representing before your name and surname. That would help enormously. And the colleagues from the agencies, if you can please do the same and identify yourselves before your name and surname in capital letters with the acronym of your agency, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. Bear with us for a few minutes. We will start at 10. Good morning again, distinguished delegates. As you start joining us for this UNDP segment today, a kind reminder to please rename yourselves in capital letters, name of the country before name and surname. That would be appreciated. It would help enormously to manage the list of speakers. For colleagues from the agencies, similarly, please do place the acronym of your agency before your name and surname, so you can we can get you down the list and make sure that we don't confuse the list of speakers with member states and colleagues from the agencies. It's 9:56. We should be starting very soon. So looking forward to a good morning of engagement.
Thank you, Jordi. And to rename yourself, it's very easy. Just to scroll your cursor over the taskbar on the top or at the bottom of your screen. Click on participants. Then you will see the list of participants and yourself. Scroll the cursor over your name, and you will see two blue buttons appearing, mute and more. Click on more, and then you will see a window appearing with rename. Click on rename, and then you will see that you can rename yourself as Jordi advised us, with the name of your delegation, of your agency, or your agency, then your name, and then your quality. Thank you. And do not hesitate to use the chat if you have any question.
Good morning, distinguished delegates, excellencies, and colleagues from the agencies. It's 10 a.m. sharp. We will be starting in a few minutes. We have 75 participants at this point. With your indulgence, we're going to give it 3 or 4 more minutes. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, please remember to place the name tag of your country, the country that you're representing, before your name and surname in capital letters. It would be very helpful to manage the list of the speakers. And also, if you are requesting the floor, please do not forget to use the hand raise function in Zoom. That helps enormously to bring you up in the list of speakers. We do have a preliminary list of speakers, so things will change. The order that you will see the hands may not necessarily be the order in which you will be given the floor, but do please use the hand raise function to request the floor, and we will then see you clearly indicated that you are wishing to do so. So again, with your indulgence, if you wait for a few more minutes, we are at 87 participants at this point. So we are going to proceed very soon. Thank you.
And to rename yourself, you can scroll your cursor over the taskbar at the top or at the bottom of your screen. And then you will see a button, Participants. Click on it. When you click on it, you will see your name appearing. Just scroll your cursor over it, and then you will see two blue buttons, Mute and More. Click on the second one, More, and then you will see a window appearing with Rename. Click on Rename, and then you can, as Jordi said, put the name of your agency or your country and your name. And do not hesitate to use the chat if you have any question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm on.
Good morning, Mr. President. You are on mute, sir.
Hello?
Yes, loud.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, sir.
Okay. Are we set?
We have 129 participants, a very diverse group of delegations. Excellencies, thank you very much for joining us this morning. The panel is ready for you, Mr. President, so whenever you are ready.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This technology thing is something else. It works when sometimes it gives you issues. I want to say good morning to everybody. It's really a pleasure to have so many people online from all over the globe participating in this virtual meeting. I declare open the sixth virtual meeting of our second regular session for 2020 of the Executive Board for UNDP, UNFPA, UNOPS. It is indeed a pleasure. The meeting is declared open. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, today we will start the UNDP segment. We will now proceed to the interactive dialogue with the UNDP's administrator. I am pleased to welcome Mr. Achim Steiner, a colleague and a friend who has been with us for many meetings, and the UNDP administrator, who will deliver his intervention to the executive board. In the course of his intervention, Mr. Steiner will also provide an update on the UNDP's COVID-19 response and introduce the report on the structured dialogue on the financing results of the UNDP's strategic plan for 2018-2021. Mr. Steiner is joined by Mr. Mohaba, acting associate administrator. He's also joined by the leadership of UNDP, who is with us. And the UNCDF management is also available to us for any questions you may have. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Achim Steiner, administrator, to deliver his intervention. Achim, welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to join you today for this interactive dialogue in order to also connect you a little bit more to where much of what UNDP is doing right now in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis. We begin with a short video that just brings a few voices from the field that are so much part of our current ability to operate and to respond. So with your permission, Mr. President, I invite our colleagues to run a short video.
Our world faces a common enemy, COVID-19. The virus does not care about nationality or ethnicity, faction or face. It attacks all relentlessly. The most vulnerable, women and children, people with disabilities, the marginalized and displaced pay the highest price. We need to be ready and take on this threat together.
UNDP Afghanistan was among the first UN agencies to respond to COVID-19 pandemic when it reached the country at the end of February. We immediately put together a program package to support the Ministry of Public Health with COVID-19 tests and other urgent health needs.
COVID-19 was an economic crisis before it became a health crisis in the Kyrgyz Republic. Kyrgyzstan has an open and service-oriented economy. So when neighboring countries closed their doors and borders for business, the economy in Kyrgyzstan started suffering immediately.
We were quick in getting boots on the ground to strengthen Iraq's health system services, especially to address the vulnerable population.
UNDP proactively supported Cameroon to face the COVID-19 pandemic by signing key agreements with partners, the World Bank, the Global Fund, and the French Corporation, and we are signing with the Islamic Bank to help the government support to the health system.
We worked with central and local governments, community-based organizations and the private sector to donate 1 million masks, 45 medical ventilators to the National Health Service, and over 400 hygiene and food kits to vulnerable populations.
Of this crisis have really been cascading. But this has also prompted Kyrgyzstan, who is a forerunner on digitalization in the region, to invest much more in digital public services. And we see an upsurge of interest in this area.
We created the Red Actua network to conduct a digital socioeconomic impact assessment, SEIA. We are conducting digital surveys every 2 months rather than one-time assessment to allow us to measure trends and provide real-time data to help the government expand social protection interventions.
We propose social protection measures in the alleviation of the immediate adverse impact of COVID-19 using global trade analysis project model we developed for Afghanistan with infection transmission scenarios developed by the Ministry of Public Health.
UNDP, working together with the Asian Development Bank and the government, undertook an assessment of socioeconomic impact and vulnerability. And this enabled us to start working with government on economic recovery also beyond the immediate term. This will also help to capitalize new sources of development finance. And in this regard, we look forward to leveraging the expertise from UNDP's Global Finance Hub on debt restructuring, debt for nature swaps, and green bonds.
UNDP has played an important role providing institutional support to the government, particularly in the area of decentralization, to ensure that the government has an adequate response to the pandemic.
At the moment, we are working in 12 governorates or provinces across the country. We are building isolation units. We are equipping them with much needed life-saving medical equipment. I have to say, we are more used to lockdowns in Iraq. We've always been working one day from the field, but another day on lockdown. We are successful because we have boots on the ground and because we are nimble and because we deliver on what we promise.
Mr. President, it is my honor to address you this morning on the occasion of our board meeting, and to do so also in the spirit with which you began this week of our board meetings when you called for a minute of silence. I join you and I join the board members in expressing my condolences to all those who have lost family members, to all those who are currently struggling with this horrible virus, and also to the families of our staff members, because amongst our staff, we have also lost colleagues during this COVID-19 crisis. They have served us well. We honor them in terms of both what they have accomplished and the work that continues. As I address you this morning, we also face across the globe many other challenges, and I only want to mention two because they are emblematic for a period of true stress that we are living through as a global family of nations and of peoples. As we speak, Hurricane Nana is descending on the Caribbean and yet again threatening people and livelihoods in this hurricane season that has already broken many records. And at the same time, on the other side of the world, in inverted commas, Typhoon Haishen is approaching southwest Japan. Just reminders that COVID-19 isn't the only challenge we face. It is, however, an unprecedented challenge in so many respects that comes on top of so many issues that we face as a global community. I address you at a moment where truly we are in the midst of a global emergency. For developing countries in particular, which are the focus of the development program of the United Nations and of all of you who serve in this board and oversee our work, just a reminder that for developing countries, the realities truly are harsh. 2 out of 3 COVID deaths are occurring in developing countries. 7 out of 10 workers work and earn their livelihoods in the informal sector. For many developing economies, that informal sector accounts for 80–90% of livelihoods. Half of the world is without social protection. It is extremely vulnerable. It does not have the kind of social welfare systems and safety nets that wealthier countries have been able to develop and therefore can rely upon. As my colleague Murad said a few days ago, it is extremely expensive to be poor in a pandemic. But for all of us in the UN, for the member states, for our communities and societies, but also for UNDP, this is truly a test case of our capacity and also of our purpose, mandates, and rationale for why we were established. From February onwards, as you know, the Secretary General, the whole United Nations family, and we in UNDP have been laser focused on how to be able to respond to this COVID-19 challenge as it unfolded. As a health crisis initially, as a humanitarian amplifier in the weeks that allowed us to understand what some of the implications would be, and then increasingly as an economic and social crisis that particularly in many developing countries almost overtook the virus in terms of its impact. The United Nations response by now is well known to you, the 3-tiered approach of both the health crisis management led by WHO, the humanitarian response, and the socioeconomic response. These are the 3 tracks along which the UN system is working, is focused on responding, and UNDP has been called upon by countries, by the Secretary General, by US member states to play a central role in this. The socioeconomic assessments and recovery plans and responses are the centerpiece of the lead responsibility that UNDP has been given by the Secretary General. And as I speak to you today, we are working across the world in 131 country teams covering 162 countries under the leadership of the resident coordinator and in close coordination with our country team sister agencies in responding. We have taken the challenge of providing the lead to the socioeconomic recovery and bringing together the capacities at country level, but also of the UN family together with DCO and our sister agencies extremely seriously. In just a few months, we have completed 117 assessments in 83 countries. We have also supported and completed 75 response plans that are capturing how countries, once they have a better understanding of who are those who are most vulnerable, in which sectors is the greatest vulnerability, what are the choices that matter most in terms of managing the crisis, but then also beginning to invest in a recovery strategy. Our work to date has proven extremely valuable, first of all, for us to make the UN development system reform come alive in the midst of this crisis, to stand by the side of our program countries, their governments and their partners in order to enable them to rapidly rethink and refocus what needs to happen next, and also to work with our sister agencies in developing rapid response frameworks. With the ILO in particular, UNDP has intensified at the highest level our collaboration. Similarly with UN Women and the publication of the gender impact of COVID-19 as a joint report with UN Women yesterday being a good illustration. With UNEP on the green economy aspects of the recovery, as well as with FAO, with UNICEF and with Habitat, just to mention a few agencies with whom we are in constant contact at the moment to provide both the global templates and frameworks, but also to be able to fulfill our mandate as an integrator in the United Nations development system. I also want to mention that in this response, our colleagues have shared with you reports as to how they have responded in the UN Capital Development Fund, the United Nations volunteers, and the UN Office on South-South Cooperation, as further illustration of how we all, as a family, have truly mobilized in this emergency. And UNDP's central role extends from the ability to both operate at the country level, but also to help the international community, the United Nations system, the Secretary General, to bring to the attention of the world the collective assessments that we are undertaking. Our publication updates on the Human Development Report Index, the analysis and proposal of considering a temporary basic income as a measure for countries to manage both the health crisis and the containment measures, but also the inevitable fallout from the socioeconomic impacts, just being two examples. We have moved with agility, we have moved fast, and we have been responsive. You have seen the offers 1.0 and offers 2.0. UNDP, from February onwards, retooled, reprogrammed, repurposed, and refocused its work. And I'm pleased to report that in the initial phase, when we were focused particularly on reinforcing the UN's capacity and that of countries to respond to the crisis, our rapid response facility, which provided $30 million as immediate injection and operating capital, proved to be extremely valuable, and more than 100 countries took advantage of this simply to be able to plan their emergency response. We also provided procurement services just in the last few months of well over $100 million, very much in the emergency mode. And we have repurposed financing, for example, from travel budgets in excess of $60 million towards what is now becoming a financial window that both with repurposed, reprogrammed, and additional financing, I'm pleased to report this morning, has surpassed the $500 million mark that we have been able to mobilize, as promised to you, as our contribution to being able to assist countries in standing up their response. We have also, in the last few weeks, taken some of these repurposed and additional funding and put them through a rapid financing facility, very much focused on the 2.0 offer that UNDP has put forward. And I briefly just mentioned that in the way that we have framed that offer, we have both reflected the outcomes of the assessments from the countries, the response strategies, and also looked at the strategic plan and UNDP's role in the context of the UN development system. The 4 areas, governance, social protection, green economy, digital disruption, are an articulation both of demand from the ground up and also where we see the greatest opportunity right now to focus our work. And in many respects, it is alignable with the strategic plan in the way that UNDP is meant to respond to also the unforeseen that can arise in the course of a 4-year planning horizon. The next generation UNDP investments, and this goes a little bit more in terms of our accountability to you also on progress in terms of evolving the institutional operations of UNDP, have proven to be extremely valuable. We have reformed and streamlined 150 business processes. We have begun to implement a year ago the digital UNDP strategy, and this year the IT strategy, elevating UNDP from an institution that was perhaps 10, 20 years behind the digital curve to being one of the frontline institutions in the arena of digital and development. The investments we made in the Sustainable Finance Hub have enabled us to quickly stand up and provide input and advice at national level, but also in supporting the UN and the Secretary General in feeding into the G20 procedures and debates with central bank governors and finance ministers, but also to assist the Secretary General in the financing dialogue that is currently being prepared with member states. We have also seen the integrated national financing frameworks emerge as a vital tool for cooperation that countries can use right now to identify what are the choices they can make with the available resources, domestic, private, public, international, and we are engaged in over 50 countries now in supporting these INFFs. Our investment in the accelerator labs has yielded very significant results. Agility, innovation, new tech, the ability to work with the entrepreneurial world have proven central to our capacity to respond. At the same time, we have continued to deliver on UNDS reform. The new modalities of working between the resident representative, the resident coordinator with the UN country teams have delivered on the promise that we made in not only enabling the reform to move forward, but to supporting its implementation on all fronts. We have also had an independent validation of the UN Board of Auditors in terms of how we have delivered on the UN development system reform. And I'm very pleased to say that the outcome of that UN Board of Auditors is essentially saying a job well done. We have completed 97.8% of the myriad of administrative steps that were required to delink. We did it on time, and we continue to be central to the support of the RC and new UNDS operating system. At the same time, we have seen also our performance improve. The efficiency of UNDP and the use of resources has continuously improved, and I was pleased already to signal to you that today 91 cents in every dollar goes towards program and services, up from 88 cents. These are just some of the indicators of where the investments over the last 12 to 24 months have not only proven transformative in providing UNDP with the momentum, but have proven extremely relevant in our ability to stand up this response that I described briefly before to COVID-19 and the moment when everything changed in 2020. But let me also say that performance, audits, evaluations, rankings, and ratings speak to the progress in next generation UNDP. We have in 2020 been rated the most transparent UN entity by the Transparency Index called the 2020 Transparency Index. And we continue to be one of the top performing institutions in the world on that index. We have seen the 15th year of a clean audit. We have seen the 3rd year in terms of balanced books on the institutional budget. And we also completed in December a long and outstanding review and completion and closure of all long-standing audit recommendations. We have been recognized also in terms of international academic publications, for instance, by the MIT Sloan Management Review on the design and implementation of the accelerator labs, which in an article just a couple of months ago was cited as an example that major corporations could look to in looking at how to foster ecosystems of innovation in an institution. We have also, with the accelerator labs, been given an award by aPolitic for a public service team award. And these are just 2 indications of the kind of recognition that also comes from outside the institution. With this, I want to essentially say to you that we have made on many of the issues that you as a board in your governance oversight capacity have enabled us and authorized us to progress with, made good progress. But let me also say that both in the evaluations and the audits, there are clear indications that we are not at all at the point of being satisfied with where we need to be. We will continue to look very carefully at how evaluations point to where the inability perhaps of UNDP to deliver on its mandate or on the integrator function or even on some core areas needs to be sharpened. How what we do next drives that progress, just as we are looking also at the audits in order to understand where are the partially satisfactory audit findings coming from? What is the driver of this and how do we address this in the way that we move forward? And a number of you have alluded also to some of the audit findings in connection with some of the vertical fund projects. We are fully cognizant of that. I assure you that in no way also do we enter this discussion with you in a defensive mode. On the contrary, we're the first ones to study these very carefully in order to understand how we can further develop our risk management systems, but also recognize that UNDP is an institution that is widely regarded and trusted and appreciated for being progressive and innovative. In having national implementation modalities, we, in a sense, yes, risk more potential risks in the way that we implement. How we manage this risk, how we try to minimize it, and also how we deal with where people essentially engage in fraudulent activity has to be at the forefront of our minds. But I assure you as a board, we are not facing a systemic issue. We are facing the optimization challenge in trying to balance the many different demands and realities that there are. Let me also briefly, and I'm moving towards the end of my presentation, President, also turn to our staff. At this moment in time, as so often, they are UNDP. Our ability to remain open, engaged on the ground when many others had to close their operations. And while we, yes, have had to close the doors of our offices, we have not closed our operations. In every country that UNDP serves right now, our staff are part of the frontline capacity. The duty of care has been at the forefront of my concern in this. And here I also want to acknowledge the excellent cooperation with the President of our Staff Council, Vesna, and the Staff Council, and indeed all staff members. They have risen to this challenge in an extraordinary fashion. And in return, I have promised to them that the duty of care is a top priority, working with the UN system on the Medivac infrastructure that allows us to guarantee staff, if they are affected by COVID, that we can take care of them, because many, indeed thousands of our staff are serving countries where even trying to travel is almost impossible. Health facilities, the first line of defense, remains something where we are working very closely with WFP, UNICEF, UNHCR, and others in our UN system in order to be able to provide additional backup capacity. These are measures we have taken out of a duty of care, but also in appreciation for the many frontline workers who continue to work right now. Let me end, Mr. President, by also addressing the fiduciary outlook. I'm pleased to report to you that, as I already mentioned, as of this moment in September 2020, UNDP is an institution that remains financially stable, but that is on the UNDP horizon always a matter of the next 6 to 12 months, because core funding, multi-annual funding remains the smallest share of our overall financing. But our balanced institutional budget last year, our objective to again not have a deficit this year, our rapid redeployment of resources and also additional financing, our strengthened engagement with particularly development finance institutions, the international financial institution in this COVID-19 crisis, additional countries who are contributing, but also reaching out to new partners, the Islamic Development Bank, national development banks, just to mention a few examples, the EBRD, are good illustrations of how we are trying to diversify the financial shock resilience capacity of UNDP and also the ability to stand up the response that is asked of us. While we doubled our cost-sharing contribution to the UN development system in 2019 and 2020 and honored our commitment, we continue to also appreciate the extraordinary investments that many countries make to UNDP, particularly our program countries. They are contributing last year $915 million to the overall financial turnover of $4.7 billion of UNDP in 2019. It is a very significant expression of trust and confidence. I also want to thank in particular those who, amongst our donor community, the traditional donor community, have not only continued to invest in core to sign multi-annual agreements, but I want to recognize in particular Germany and Japan, who in their supplementary budgets in 2020 have actually stepped up their contributions. And this is the kind of response that we need right now if you wish UNDP to continue to play the role that I have described to you. Central to the UN response, a partner in 170 countries on the ground, able to mobilize a global network and able to repurpose and assist countries at the strategic, at the policy, at the crisis, but also in the invest in recovery strategic direction level being able to work. You have asked, what are we doing in order to prepare for an uncertain outlook in terms of financing? I end by saying to you, this is a perennial condition. At the beginning of a year, on the 1st of January, we never know what our budgets will be for that year because so much can happen, and still 87% of our funding is essentially non-core. We are preparing resilience scenarios. We are investing heavily in trying to engage with partners in order to be able to mobilize resources at the same time. Yes, we have scenarios and they will not surprise you. If countries begin to, which I would deeply regret, cut back on ODA, cut back in their ability to support countries at this critical moment, and I'm not even talking about the global challenges of debt and other macro financial areas, but simply the ability to finance the support that the United Nations family and we as part of it at UNDP are delivering right now across the globe. If that funding is cut, then imagination doesn't have to take us very far. The first step will be to manage vacancies, not reappoint staff, drive down our operational funding, and ultimately begin to close operations in countries. This is the simple way in which to respond to what some of you have asked is the scenario. But let me say to you right now, our focus is not on trying to manage a reduced financial envelope. We know the risks are high, but in everything we are doing, we are trying to demonstrate alongside you, your ministers, your parliaments, how central, how vital, and how valuable the multilateral system is to be able to have a global response feasible. As so many have said, this virus is everywhere. It will not stop. It will continue to threaten everyone until it is under control everywhere. And we are an integral part of helping nations to be able to deal with that. Let me end by just saying that as we look forward, we also have changes happening in our organization. I want to thank in particular Judith Karl, our colleague Olivier, who has led the United Nations volunteers, and Jorge Chediek in the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation. All three of them are joining us at this board meeting for the last time. They will be stepping down. I thank them for their service. I thank them for the ability of their respective institutions to rise up to the challenge also of adapting to COVID-19, and would like on behalf of the board also to thank them for their service, many of them literally for decades serving the United Nations family. And I end by thanking you as our board members for the continued engagement that you have provided through this crisis. It has not been easy. Indeed, it has been challenging, but Mr. President, here we are, the second board meeting online. We have held our side of the promise, which is to enable you to oversee the organization in the midst of this crisis, to maintain the governance function of UNDP. And we are deeply grateful for the way that you have also accepted to improvise and to accept that not everything is working quite as it is normally. But if there's one thing I can say to you in closing my remarks is, we have not for a moment since February of 2020 stepped back. We have stepped forward. We maintain laser focused on ensuring that UNDP plays the role that you expect us to play, and that we maintain also a strong understanding of our integrator role, that we are not ignoring the risks that lie ahead of us, that our work in responding to COVID is in fact strongly aligned with the strategic plan and our ability to be the development program of the United Nations and a backbone to its UN development system. Thank you very much, and on behalf of all of our staff worldwide, I thank you also for the confidence and trust that you have placed in us at this very challenging time. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Steiner for his presentation, his statement. Thank you for the information shared. We will now open the floor for statements, comments, questions from the members of the board. We will begin by hearing from representatives speaking on behalf of groups, and then we will take individual national statements. We will begin with Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Sweden, Ambassador Armstrong, speaking on behalf of the Bureau. Ambassador, you have the floor, please.
President, thank you so much, and Mr. Steiner, a lot of appreciation for your statement. I'd like to make a few remarks on behalf of the Bureau. At the outset, let me pay our respect to the UNDP staff around the world who have worked under unprecedented circumstances these last months, often at high personal cost. We are humbled by the professionalism and delivery you have showcased. We wish to thank you and the entire UNDP team. The COVID-19 outbreak has exposed inequalities within and between countries. Most of the long-term consequences of COVID pandemic are indeed still uncertain. But as the Secretary General and you yourself, Mr. Steiner, have said, the most vulnerable pay the highest price. We must not fail them. They too must reap the benefit of the recovery, both short-term and long-term. Mr. Steiner, We commend the work of UNDP as the technical lead agency in the socio-economic response framework. Rest assured that we support you in these efforts. UNDP has been at the forefront of the UN's response to COVID-19, proving the central role it plays in the UN system. While the immediate effects of the crisis are still felt, the agency has even a more important and daunting task ahead of it, as many countries are charting their pathways into a new normal. Forceful actions to address inequalities, marginalizations, and discrimination are essential cornerstones in building prosperous and green societies, and UNDP has a unique mandate to support countries in doing so. Looking ahead, it is becoming increasingly clear that addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and other global challenges in many ways demand the same response. This is an opportunity, but above all, a responsibility. The 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement on climate change continue to be the blueprints for our actions. UN General Assembly 75 is approaching soon. Things will be different this year, but the fundamentals will be the same. We must address the challenges of our time, both new and old, through collective action. UNDP's role has never been more relevant and important. Thank you so much.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Sweden and the Vice President of the WEOC Group for her statement on behalf of the Bureau. I now invite the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Netherlands to make a statement on behalf of a group of countries. You have the floor, please, Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning, everybody. I will deliver a short version of the joint statement and kindly ask UNDP and delegations to take note of the full version that has been uploaded to Paper Smart. I deliver this statement on behalf of Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, the Republic of Korea, the Republic of Moldova, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and my own country, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Let me start by thanking the administrator for his statement, and I would like to join him and the Vice President in expressing our appreciation for staff that have continued to work on the very difficult circumstances. Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic has again brought to light the essential role of core funding in order to be able to quickly respond to unforeseen events. We welcome the efforts already made to improve visibility and recognitions of donors providing core funding during the COVID-19 response, and would welcome further efforts in this regard. Because, as the administrator clearly outlined, the coronavirus sees no borders, and its impact on development countries is immense. This means that we cannot take for granted the progress made towards the SDGs so far. Now, more than ever, it is important to keep the promise that no one will be left behind, while at the same time, as UNDP puts it, building a better and greener future. Mr. President, we would like to ask UNDP to assess which strategic plan outcomes will be most impacted by COVID-19 and to provide regular updates on this to the Executive Board. We understand the need to maintain sustainable and predictable financing of UNDP's strategic plan, and we would therefore welcome UNDP's thoughts on the continued financing of UNDP for the next 2 years of the strategic plan. In this context, let me express our appreciation for UNDP's joint efforts with UNFPA, UNICEF and UN Women to improve the structured funding dialogues, to strengthen reporting on funding compact implementation, and to engage the executive boards on this matter. Such interactive dialogue with the executive boards will inform and guide funding decisions and help to ensure that the budget is both fully funded as well as allocations that are aligned with strategic plan priorities. Mr. President, allow me to share 3 questions on our part. First, in order to reach more sustainable funding, expanding and diversifying the core donor base is essential. In this regard, we are concerned that regular resources accounted for only 13% of total funding to UNDP in 2019. We would welcome UNDP's reflections on efforts made to increase the number of donors to regular resources and the challenges faced in this regard. Second, we encourage UNDP to increase its share of development-related expenditures through joint activities and to work with other UNDS entities, in particular DCO, to come to a clear definition of development expenditures delivered through joint activities. We are particularly keen to know when such a definition is expected to be agreed upon and operational. In line with this, we are also interested in hearing how UNDP plans further harmonization of other indicators of funding compact implementation. Third, we strongly welcome the costing for results exercise undertaken and the funding gap analysis that resulted from that exercise. The analysis goes a long way in responding to our requests for further information on the budget, on available resources, and on possible financial gaps. The analysis is clear, and we would like to hear more on how UNDP will ensure that all areas of the strategic plan receive adequate funding, and on possible plans to move even further from project towards more core, thematic, and programmatic funding. And finally, let us not forget that meeting the commitments of the funding compact is as relevant as ever, and this goes for member states as well as for UNDS entities. Mr. President, thanks again for giving me the floor. And as this is my first intervention in my new capacity as the permanent representative of the Netherlands, let me take this opportunity to assure you that I look forward to engage with all member states, UN funds and programs, and other stakeholders to further strengthen the work of UNDP and UN development system more broadly in the years to come. Thank you.
My apologies, Excellency. It was just brought to my notice that you are the new PR of the Netherlands, and we are delighted to welcome you to the New York family of ambassadors and nations. And we are even more delighted to welcome you to be as a member of this board. And again, my apologies for the earlier introduction. I am indeed delighted, and I look forward to meeting you, as we have experienced and shared many very positive and wonderful moments with your predecessor and working along with your colleagues in your mission. A hearty welcome to New York and to the board. We will now hear from the permanent representative of Colombia, who would make a statement in his national capacity. Excellency, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Administrator, Mr. Executive Secretary, and members of the Executive Board. Thank you for convening this important session of the Executive Board. I would like to start highlighting the role of UNDP in Colombia and its significant support in the coordination of a national response to the pandemic, especially in relation to the socioeconomic reactivation and integration of migration from Venezuela. This global and local response to the threat of COVID-19 has been facilitated due to the implementation of the reform of the United Nations Development System. There is no doubt that the reform has set the basis of a valuable process of renewing the relationship of the agencies, funds, and programs with the states by strengthening the interagency work and reducing the duplication of efforts and the atomization of cooperation. The strategic vision of UNDP has favored this organizational transformation, as well as the creation of an entity fit for purpose and oriented to lead the future of the development in the world. In this context, I want to refer to three elements that I consider relevant for this strategic planning process that is about to start. First, Colombia values UNDP efforts to increase joint work within the United Nations country team and one of the principles of the reform. We encourage the program to implement new mechanisms and partnership schemes to share with different entities of the United Nations system. It has the purpose of allowing a better use of our limited assets, avoiding duplication in procedures, and reducing competition for resources between agencies. Second, given the advances in the field of the structured finance dialogue, it is important to seek and implement innovative forms of financing to avoid outlays or higher fees by member states and to mitigate the risk of depending on traditional financial sources. Third, regarding UNDP international cooperation with middle-income countries, it is necessary to remember that MICs represent the biggest number of developing countries and the poorest and most vulnerable people of the world. Therefore, Colombia considers that the classification of countries by income level is insufficient to measure the progress toward multidimensional development. This restrictive classification also limits UNDP's ability to respond to the complex challenges facing those nations. It will be appropriate to have a specific vision on international cooperation given these circumstances. To conclude, Colombia would like to reiterate support to UNDP and looks forward to the adoption of our new CDP that will focus the future work on the field of peace with legality, migratory challenges, and catalytic SDGs. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Colombia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Egypt. My good friend, Ambassador Mohammed, you have the floor, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Allow me to thank you, my dear brother, Ambassador Walter Webson, the President of the Executive Board, PR of Antigua and Barbuda, for all the efforts you made during the different meetings of the board this year. Allow me also to welcome our dear colleague, the PR of the Netherlands, and wish her good luck in her mission in New York. Let me to express our congratulations to Mr. Achim Steiner, UNDP Administrator, and his team, whom are joining us in this meeting, and who are other in the headquarters and in the field, and to congratulate members of the Bureau for the leadership of the work of the Executive Board, particularly during this critical time. Indeed, we appreciate this regular engagement with Distinguished Administrator, Mr. Achim Steiner, and his keenness to interact and to brief us regularly on the developments. And really, these occasions are both informative and appreciative. Informative occasion to be updated with information and also to express due appreciation to him and his team and to the responsiveness of UNDP, whether the time of the responsiveness with the will, with the capacity, and with the timeline as well, the timely response. And I received the session UNDP is planning on Lebanon shortly, and this is very indicative also of the responsiveness we have from the UNDP. Needless to say that the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated poverty and structural inequalities, and it has caused a global crisis affecting humanity on all levels, including the social, economic, and environmental spheres, and it's attacking societies indiscriminately. There are serious economic challenges due to the loss of income, the lockdowns, the closure of business, building sites and markets. Are all these aspects means there are few opportunities available for us and serious challenges facing our societies. There is a need for a large scale, coordinated and comprehensive multilateral response on this crisis, as this crisis is truly global. It is in everyone's interest to ensure that developing countries have the best chance to address this crisis and to go through this crisis and to avoid COVID-19 becoming a risk to against long and to becoming a lasting break to economic recovery. And this indeed requires unleashing all the potentials of the societies, especially in developing countries, especially youth, women, girls, and the innovative capacities. And we always reiterate that UNDP and the administrator are giving special attention to innovation and technology dimension. In this vein, I welcome the efforts made by the UNDP in Africa and in the Arab states, especially that the health systems in many of our countries are associated with economic costs, and this risks derailing socioeconomic development trajectory of the Global Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2063 in the African countries. The need also to allocate programs and activities in the low and middle income countries, especially that they are facing the threat with increasing debt crisis. Welcoming also the UNDP COVID socioeconomic impact recovery aspect at the country level in supporting countries to first generate evidence of impact and then make informed decisions on how to tackle it. And there is a need to intensify all such efforts. While every society is vulnerable to crisis, their abilities to respond differs significantly around the world. That's why we need a collaborative approach to the challenges posed by COVID-19. To conclude, I would like to thank UNDP for its continuous efforts to respond to practical needs through its institutional infrastructure, especially that they are working in my country, Egypt, closely with the government to ensure the implementation of initiatives for socioeconomic recovery. I will end my question about the planning, the future planning. Actually, at the beginning of this crisis, most of us maybe thought that we are facing a crisis of few months and then it will be over. But as we are seeing that now we are embarking on a long-term challenge. So how the UNDP is adjusting its planning parameters and benchmarks and what time frame is envisaged and what resources are required based on this planning and based on these parameters and benchmarks, which quite frankly is very challenging to do because many of it are still unknown. But how readjusting of the planning is happening within the UNDP. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Excellency. Thank you, my brother. We will now, we'll take 3 more questions, Bangladesh, El Salvador, and the Dominican Republic, and then I will give it back to Mr. Steiner and his team for responses. So I'll now invite the permanent representative of Bangladesh, my dear friend and sister, to make her statement. Ambassador Rabbi, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. I thank you, Mr. President, and congratulations on your excellent stewardship of the board. Mr. Steiner, I thank you for your excellent presentation on the state of affairs and UNDP's response to the impact of COVID-19. I pay tribute to all frontline UNDP staff and the entire UNDP team under your leadership for their dedicated service during this crisis. UNDP has an important role to play in supporting national response and recovery efforts, and its role is now more important than ever before. In Bangladesh, we are continuing to enforce pandemic protocols and measures to maintain the health and safety of our people while ensuring limited business continuity to ensure their livelihood. You mentioned about the research commissioned by UNDP, which suggested that providing guaranteed temporary basic income, TBI, to the poorest people could slow the surge of COVID-19 by enabling them to stay home. That was what Bangladesh did in the early stage of the pandemic by rolling out timely economic stimulus measures and social protection schemes of $12.13 billion. This early intervention resulted in containing the spread of COVID-19 in Bangladesh. If the pandemic is to continue, it would take its toll on the economy across all sectors, especially in the informal sector where a large segment of the population is concentrated. The economic downturn in other countries is also affecting us as exports and remittance earnings continue to fall. Mr. Steiner, we would like to know whether UNDP has any plans to scale up programs to ensure TBI by arranging funding through MFIs and other sources for the poorest segment of the population in the developing countries. Secondly, digital disruption and exclusion are stark realities that stand in the way of SDG implementation and more profoundly felt in the pandemic situation. If you can share specific programs, if you can share with us of any specific programs by UNDP to address these gaps in the developing countries. And finally, if you could share your thoughts on measures by UNDP for the climate vulnerable countries where the situation has been compounded by the pandemic. I thank you, Mr. President, and we look forward to our continued good collaboration with UNDP. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Bangladesh. Thank you, Excellency, for your statement. And I now invite the distinguished permanent representative of El Salvador to make a statement. Excellency, you have the floor, please.
Mr. President, I think the distinguished permanent representative of El Salvador may not be ready yet. So the next on the list would be the distinguished permanent representative of.
Okay, thank you. So we shall move to the permanent representative of the Dominican Republic, and after which we will return to the administrator and his team. So I give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of the Dominican Republic. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you to the Secretariat and to the Executive Board. We are really very excited of participating in this meeting and appreciate it very much. First of all, we would like to express that we bow ourselves with reverence to all victims of this pandemic situation we are experiencing. And in that sense, we appreciate and recognize the very important participation of the UNDP in facing this crisis in the Dominican Republic. Thank God, we have been having results of managing the crisis, but in that sense, we must, and we're happy to recognize that the UNDP have worked hard, hand in hand with the government of the DR. In that sense also, we appreciate and look forward the recovery phase increasing, maintaining and increasing the cooperation with this multilateral system that have proved once again that we need it, we can handle, and we can achieve good responses. Thank you very much once again.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of the Dominican Republic, and my brother, it's very good to have you with us. So I'm going to ask Mr. Steiner and his team to respond to the number of points, questions, and comments. Akim, you and your team, please.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Excellencies, for your comments. Let me preface my remarks that the three reports or documents that I submitted to you in part are already an initial response to some of the questions that have been raised on the reform on the COVID response and also on the administrator's report. But as we have practiced for the last two board sessions following this Q&A, we will also provide written answers, because sometimes it is difficult to have immediately all either the facts or the numbers available. So I will do my best with my colleagues to respond to the comments and the questions that have been raised. And I begin with the Ambassador of Sweden's remarks that, and from all of you on behalf of UNDP staff, thank you for your kind remarks. I think what I have sensed, and with our President of the Staff Council, we have looked very much at how our staff are faring in this process. I think they will very much appreciate the recognition. I think for all of them, this has been a moment of reckoning in personal terms. Many of us have families, being in a non-family duty station in the midst of a country such as Yemen right now, not knowing whether you can even be evacuated if you contract COVID-19. I think it is, in its small way, but nevertheless a very real way, true heroism. And yet in the service of the United Nations, we often take it for granted, whether it's our peacekeepers, our humanitarian colleagues, or our colleagues who are currently working on the front lines. So your appreciation truly means a lot to us, to them, and I thank you for that. I also appreciate the Ambassador of Sweden's remark with which she ended, that in many ways, this is the 75th anniversary of the UN. There is a great deal of questioning and introspection about the United Nations, about its relevance, its ability to be responsive to the challenges of our time. I wish sometimes that the world would know more about how much the UN has formed the backbone of a global response to this COVID-19 pandemic. I think in that introspection, in that focus on one's own challenges and struggles, it is inevitable, it is natural, it is human that one loses sight of the struggle of others, but also of an institutional idea that, born in 1945, was precisely also born for a moment in which we depend on one another to be able to act. And whether that is in a health context, in a humanitarian solidarity context, or in that broader development cooperation where our ability to help each other ultimately strengthens our own resilience and our ability to come out of this crisis. And I think in your words, UNDP's role perhaps has never been as important as relevant, is very much a sentiment with which I and my senior leadership team have embraced this challenge. It was not foreseeable, although it was predicted. It is not something you can ever prepare for adequately, but much of what then defines the value, the relevance, and the effectiveness of your response is your ability as an institution to respond, react, to be agile, to be very clear in terms of what you see are the immediate needs on the ground. And yet, and I think this is the true, distinctive, and genuinely value-added contribution of UNDP in concert with our sister agencies, funds, and programs, to focus on managing a crisis in which very difficult choices become absolute moments for prime ministers, for cabinets, for parliaments. And frankly speaking, we all know in richer countries, we have mobilized funds and will do whatever it takes. And poorer countries, we will mobilize and we will do whatever we can afford. And this has brought so much into relief and contrast also that inequality and poverty and economic capacity, or if you are in a G20 meeting, we refer to it as fiscal space, essentially the ability of governments to just mount the most fundamental responses in this COVID-19 is not only something that can be defined in terms of a national budget and a national economy. This virus is global, this pandemic is global, its contagion not only as a virus, but in economic terms, in social and political and geopolitical security terms, is global. And I think where UNDP is both a critical integral part of reinforcing the crisis response, the medical and health systems response, but immediately link it also to the ability of a government to immediately identify who are the most vulnerable in my country right now. Where does public support become immediately something that is valuable and transformative in this crisis? But, and herein lies very much the focus of our Offer 2.0, we have to get back to a development pathway. It is the only way forward. And it cannot be in the debate over whether a lockdown should be observed or not, whether masks hinder us. It has to be in an intelligent, smart, responsible way in which governments can provide that touchstone for the private sector, for citizens, for political parties to recognize that it is in the way that we manage the crisis, that we leverage the crisis investments to stabilize our economies, we already sow the seeds of a development recovery. This is why UNDP so quickly followed up on the offer 1.0 with an offer 2.0, because it speaks to the core of the DNA of crisis and recovery management, and building into that very much an appreciation that neither the politics of our national debates on what matters, nor the economic opportunities, nor the social responses will in any way be the same a year from now than they were a year ago. This is quite clear. And I was struck by President Macron, who in an interview with the Financial Times just said, have you realized how profound a moment this is? This has been a moment where the preeminence of human life, of what makes us humans and what makes us concerned about living and surviving, has taken precedent over the dominant paradigm of economics and the economy that has been so central in the last decades, and that already created the tensions. So I allow me briefly to take this discourse, because in many of your comments, Excellencies, you echoed what, in the medical domain we call the underlying conditions, but think back to the Human Development Report 2019. It is almost prophetic in the way that it began to focus on the existing corrosive nature of inequality, but it was also future focused, and it looked at climate change and it looked at digitalization as two potentially significant amplifiers, either of greater inequality or of our ability to reduce inequality. And hell, has this pandemic demonstrated what the impact of having access to digital means or not having access. Be it for the students, the 1.2 or more billion students who have had essentially a year of their life, of their learning ability taken away from them. And yes, in richer countries, for those of us who are able to afford digital connectivity, there was an ability to compensate, but for most it hasn't. And again, it is also the inability to predict whether many of those students actually will go back. And we worry most about girls and their ability out of this crisis to return to an formal education system as opposed to simply being taken out of it. And I also want to emphasize here that the Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Finance and the SDGs, the report of which was just launched last week, was fortuitous in building on his digital cooperation panel, but then homing in precisely on the significance and centrality of something that we knew was going to change the face of development. We thought it would happen over the next 5 to 10 years, namely digitalization. This pandemic has taught us the extraordinary opportunities, but also the extraordinary risks and the centrality of public policy and of shaping an ecosystem of digitalization that is inclusive, that is responsive, and that is capable of enabling us to manage things that otherwise would be totally unmanageable. And that, I think, is why UNDP, the Development Program of the United Nations, its singular dedication to maintaining a focus on the SDGs as both something that unites us as nations that need to come together, but that also defines a framework within which national decision-making, prioritization, choices that need to be made right now cannot only be made with a short-term horizon, but in fact, by having that compass, will actually allow countries to both manage the crisis more effectively, but also recover more quickly. And I think in that way, I want to respond to some of the more broad developmental roles and contributions that UNDP can make, both in terms of bringing our 360-degree competence and capacity of the UN family together, but also in being a partner to prime ministers, to presidents, to cabinet, and to parliaments and to citizens right now who are facing these. And we have, in recent weeks, repeatedly been invited by presidents and prime ministers to advise them on choices. And to the PR of Bangladesh, our decision to publish in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, the temporary basic income paper, was a difficult decision because there is so much being debated and discussed. Controversy and polarization in these debates are clearly making daily decision-making more difficult. But what UNDP proved with the temporary basic income paper is that we can translate in a matter of weeks analysis from over 100 countries, their assessments and their response strategies into a global visibility of a key policy option that is relevant to an individual country, but also points to the centrality of looking at how we finance this. And here is the link between a national decision, such as yours in Bangladesh, and a number of other countries to essentially put a temporary basic income into play, but also the fiscal space drama. And in my capacity as representing the UN family in the G20 track of finance ministers, central bank governors, in the FFD dialogue, and working with the Secretary General and the DSG on this, it has been a preoccupation of ours that we need to recognize that debt in its current projected impact on economies not only represents a short-term mega risk for our global economy and our financial system, it is also a strangulation of the fiscal space for many countries. That's why the linkage of an ability to implement largely through national resources a temporary basic income, because that is the reality for most countries, can actually be facilitated if a debt standstill creates the fiscal space. And that's why our work, rooted in the reality of so many countries, but then aggregated to a global policy agenda that countries in a multilateral context can transact, is so critical, alongside the integration approach. Let me also respond by saying that you have spoken to climate change, to finance. We have maintained, in the midst of this crisis and disruption, a very strong focus on key tenets of our work, because we believe they actually connect the crisis to the future. They connect us also to the global agenda, be it the Paris Agreement that the Swedish ambassador referred to, or the SDGs, or indeed other elements. And our work, both on the climate promise, continues without delay. What we do see is that countries have to delay the submission of their NDCs, but right now, 114 countries are part of the climate promise, where we work with other agencies and partners, the NDC partnership, to assist them in linking their formulation of greater ambition in the NDC precisely to also a recovery strategy, that green economy opportunity that can combine a climate change transformational pathway to an immediate crisis management and investment priority setting exercise. It is critical. And to the small island developing states, I say in particular, we are working right now on a special initiative on a major renewable energy response in order to assist many of them to be able to realize the green-blue economy objectives that they have spelled out, the Samoan pathway, with a crisis response in the midst of also a financially constrained environment. But our work also on the SDG impact norms and standards that we are working on is a critical part of helping governments being able to mobilize bonds in the bond market, to borrow on SDGs, but also to look at equity markets and see how SDGs can leverage private capital to become a far more significant investment in SDG-aligned outcomes. The same was reaffirmed by the Digital Finance Task Force when it looked at the opportunity, and we are studying with Bangladesh ambassador right now, the mobilization of micro savings in terms of raising national development infrastructure finance bonds. There are enormous opportunities opening up here, and therefore to the ambassador of Colombia's remarks, how are we focusing on this? Yes, we are. But it also includes not only the LDCs. You spoke, Ambassador, to middle-income countries. You will at this board meeting review the evaluation of our work in middle-income countries. I have to say to you, the discussions we've had in the board of why does it make sense to have a United Nations development system, but particularly also the development program of the United Nations engage in middle-income countries, has not only been demonstrated by this pandemic, but indeed by much of what now affects global security, human security, our ability to manage poverty eradication, but also the emergence of extremism and radicalization. Many of these trends are threatening global peace and security in middle-income countries, both in terms of their domestic reality, but also in terms of the international implications. Development is at the heart of addressing the contradictions and the failures, but also the potential opportunities that are embedded in the choices that countries will make to address inequality, sustainability, discrimination, conflict, the drivers of precisely the antidote that we associate with the development agenda. A couple of brief remarks, President, then I'll finish to the Ambassador of the Netherlands. And Joka, welcome to New York in this very challenging time. It's good to have a colleague and a friend leading the Kingdom of the Netherlands voice here in New York. I took a number of questions from you, and I will respond to them in writing because they go into more detail. But you had one in particularly on diversifying core resources. I think a concern we all share, although it is slightly improved from last year and the year before, UNDP remains a largely project-funded, non-core funded entity. There is no magic wand here, except to continue with the funding compact, but also in the way that we develop our office, thematic funding windows, to continue to leverage and encourage member states to invest in UNDP as a value proposition. I think we have seen a number of countries, and I mentioned Germany earlier on, which has now doubled its core funding this year. Other countries who have maintained their core funding already at high levels, and countries who have signed multi-year agreements. All of this helps to consolidate a more strategic capacity of the institution to respond. We're engaged with many of you in both trying to understand how do we best explain this value added? How do we best reach your parliaments and your citizens in order to appreciate how important it is to have a United Nations system that reaches, first of all, many parts of the world that bilateral aid will not reach, how a bilateral engagement truly can complement and is complemented and enlarged by multilateral cooperation. We often do that at the country level. We don't speak enough about it. But also how pitiful, frankly speaking, in the end, the world's investment in this backbone to international collaboration, solidarity, and cooperation, the current contributions are. The Secretary General is yet again having to beg for the basic contributions of the United Nations regular budget for the third time in 12 months. I think in UNDP, we are deeply appreciative that we are an institution that has a significant budget. And in that sense, we do not lament. What we take as our task is to broaden the donor base. And I want to remind us that I do not think there is any other institution in the UN and maybe in the world that has as much from its program countries in terms of co-investment. Almost $1 billion of our annual financial resources are in fact co-invested by program countries. This is evidence of not only significant trust, but of co-financing. We have also seen new countries and partners come, Qatar being one of them a year and a half ago. I encourage many other countries to consider becoming a more significant either thematic or core donor in UNDP. But I also have to say, I'm concerned right now because in many of our traditional donor capitals who form our OECD development donor group, the discussions about reducing development funds in ODA baffles me. Not because I understand the sentiment and the challenge and the pressure domestically, but wisdom, foresight, and an appreciation of what value the UN family, but also UNDP represents by putting $1, €1, or whatever currency it may be through the system and leveraging maybe 100 of other countries' money in order to address a problem that otherwise would be unaddressable, certainly not bilaterally, is something we have to continue to promote. We remain very focused, Excellencies, on diversifying and increasing core resources. I think as UNDP, we should be recognized as actually being remarkably successful in having program countries buy into the work of the services UNDP provides.
Mr.
But yes,
Steiner, maybe you could wrap up a little bit so we can get in some more questions.
Well, if you allow me one more comment, which is on the funding gap analysis and the ability to respond to an uncertainty. I will offer you in the next few weeks more information on that. Certainly in UNDP, the implications are we have limited scope for compensating for when funding shortfalls arise under different areas of the strategic plan. but through track financing, but also in the COVID response. Let me just mention one example to show you how I and our senior management have tried to respond. In the rapid financing facility, the 30 million I mentioned at the beginning, rapid response facility, excuse me, and in the second rapid response facility of 100 million, we made it an obligation that gender is an integral part of any response that we design, that we work on, and therefore we have included in virtually every one of our funding responses in over 100 countries, a direct and explicit gender element to this. So it's just an illustration of how we are trying to address this. And just a last word on Lebanon that Ambassador Idris also mentioned. Let me just say that we are heartbroken by what we have seen happening, by the struggle in trying to motivate people in the country, but also international partners, to not lose hope. But we are there, the UN system is there, and I think in some of the measures that are now being put in place lie the seeds of perhaps a more promising future. Thank you, President. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And one of the innovations that has worked well during the COVID, during the COVID readjustment of how we work, is the written responses. So we will continue to depend on that piece of innovation, that meetings like these, we know we can't get in enough time to truly respond to all of the questions and or truly make the statements as broad as we would like, as many people would like. So what was very useful is a written response to the questions that have not been answered, and we look forward to that. So, and also we had circulated before the meeting the statements of the administrator, so that too provides further details into the discussions that we're having here. And it's always unfortunate when we have to cut the answers short, but thank you so much. So we have the Deputy Permanent Representative of Japan, followed by the DPR of Russia, followed by the Delegate of China, and we will begin with the statement, with the comments or questions by the representative of Japan. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished Bureau members, Your Excellencies, good morning. I thank Mr. Stein for his insightful speech. I join the appreciation for the engagement of your staff on the front line and renew our commitment to support for your activities since I take the floor for the first time. I would like to touch upon 3 issues. First, as described in the speech, the pandemic of the coronavirus caused the global socio-economic crisis, which we regard as a human security crisis, as you mentioned. Therefore, Japan made our contribution at an early stage to leave no one behind by assisting the vulnerable people. But the crisis is also a longer-term development challenge. We have high expectations for the Offer 2.0, which aims to transform the society for building back better. In this context, I'm keen to know if 4 areas highlighted in the Offer 2.0 will also be pillars of your next strategic plan. Second, we fully acknowledge the criticality of core contributions. That is why we have increased our core contribution this year. At the same time, we find it important to absorb the needs of the field and formulate projects from the bottom up. Our earmarked contribution projects are formulated based on the proposal from the country office in close consultation with the host governments. In response to the COVID-19, I believe that core budget projects and earmarked projects should complement each other from immediate support to recover better in a seamless manner. I would like to hear your view. Lastly, we appreciate the efforts of the Accelerator Lab as an initiative to find innovative and comprehensive solutions based on local ownership. We believe the lab should facilitate the participation of a broader range of private funds, including foreign companies, so that the lab's activities can be made sustainable. What is the strategy of UNDP to attract private funding to the activities of the lab? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now hear a statement or comments from the Deputy Permanent Representative of China. You have the floor, please, China.
Mr. President, Excellencies and colleagues, I thank you, Mr. President, for your smart leadership of the Executive Board and for the collective efforts of the Bureau in organizing the second regular session effectively amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks to Administrator Stan for his support and the work of UNDP. China appreciates UNDP's support for developing countries in their effort to combat COVID-19 and achieve economic and social recovery. We hope that UNDP will continue to put people at the center and follow the guidance of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in strengthening capability building for program countries to achieve inclusive and sustainable development. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. The UN has made irreplaceable contributions to world peace and development. The international community should stand together to safeguard multilateralism and strengthen the role of multilateral institutions. We call on all parties to maintain and increase their financial support, among others, to UNDP. It is hoped that the Executive Board will maintain unity and guide, support, and supervise the work of the agency. China values its long-standing cooperation relations with UNDP and appreciates UNDP's contributions to China's economic and social development. China is ready to strengthen cooperation with UNDP on country program and jointly support poverty reduction and development in developing countries. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of China for his statement. I will now give the floor to the distinguished Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom and Great Britain for his statement and or comments. Sir, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Kuwait, Luxembourg, Lithuania, Mexico, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Republic of Korea, Republic of Moldova, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, Ukraine, United States of America, and my own country, the United Kingdom. Mr. President, COVID-19 is testing the limits of the UN development system reform and at the same time emphasizing the imperative of implementing those reforms. Without these, we anticipate that the development system would not have been able to respond with the same degree of agility and coherence that we've seen over the past 6 months. For example, the coordination between the humanitarian and development system has enabled the agencies to be more responsive to the pressing needs of populations most immediately affected by COVID-19, whilst planning for the long-term recovery. We stress the importance of maintaining this momentum. As the world continues to face the multiple consequences of COVID-19 and prepares to build back better and greener, we must ensure that the reform principles are at the core of the UN response. As member states, our commitment to reform is steadfast, and we know this is shared by the agencies and resident coordinators. In order to translate this commitment into reality, we need actions by the agencies and their representatives at all levels. They must follow through on reform commitments to ensure harmonized, efficient, and robust policy. Programmatic and corporate approaches are also critical. Allow me to highlight 5 key areas in which we would like to see further concerted action. First, in coordination and collaboration. This is the bedrock of reform. Through policy mainstreaming, joint activities, and the leadership of resident coordinators, COVID-19 has put coordination to the test. The Global Humanitarian Response Plan, a UN framework for the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19, and the Multi-Partner Trust Fund are positive examples of this in practice. Agencies must continue to pursue joint activities and collaborate, focusing on their respective strengths and comparative advantages at all levels. Furthermore, we underline the system-wide coordination role of UN Women on gender equality and the empowerment of women. The second point is on efficiencies. We note the potential efficiencies that can be achieved through the implementation of the Business Innovation Group's research findings and its related work, and urge all agencies to now demonstrate progress on this initiative. Third, the funding compact. This is another cornerstone of reform, and agencies must ensure that they have set comprehensive baselines, milestones, and targets for all relevant indicators, including where aggregated figures exist. The mutual responsibility of member states on the funding compact is also recognized. Fourth, the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Frameworks. As member states, we reiterate the importance of ensuring CPDs are derived from UNSDCFs, including through agencies' close work with the Development Coordination Office and with resident coordinators. This also requires meaningful in-country consultation with member states of both UNSDCFs and CPDs prior to adoption of those CPDs. And fifth, the Management Accountability Framework. We expect full implementation of the MAF, including mutual performance appraisals, and would like to have regular updates from agencies and DCO on the implementation progress. Mr. President, the reform process is not limited to the aforementioned initiatives, and we call on all agencies and the RCs to take a holistic approach to delivering the SDGs. This includes ensuring agency alignment with the quadrennial comprehensive policy review, including on reform priorities such as efficiency and effectiveness, and thematic priorities such as the inclusion of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls and persons with disabilities. It should also include the Peace Humanitarian Development Nexus and climate and environment. As we move forward into the development of new strategic plans for 2022 and 2025, we encourage agencies to apply this approach and engage closely with the Executive Board with sufficient time and consultation as the development of strategic plans and results frameworks progresses. Additionally, agencies must ensure sufficient humanitarian competency and resource as respectively appropriate. As the resident coordinator's role takes in an increased range of humanitarian activities due to COVID-19, the importance of humanitarian competencies, including international humanitarian law and humanitarian access negotiations, is highlighted, as well as the need to strengthen humanitarian capacities and integration with development programming in the field, particularly in agencies with a double mandate such as UNICEF and UNFPA. Mr. President, as we look to the year ahead and a green, inclusive and resilient recovery, building back better and greener, is a chance to continue to implement the reform process and ensure the recovery continues to be supported through strengthened coordination across the funds and programs and the wider UN development system. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. We will now hear a statement by the Deputy Permanent Representative of Russia. You have the floor, please, Ambassador. Dimitri?
Do you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Thank you very much. We would like, dear Mr. President, dear colleagues, we would like to join those who are thanking UNDP staff worldwide for their hard work, especially during these challenging times. Russia appreciates the level of cooperation with the UNDP and the thematic scope of our projects focused mainly on the promotion of socio-economic development of partner countries. We're grateful for the update on UNDP's work with the governments on preparing the assessments of impact of COVID-19 and facilitating their recovery. We took note with appreciation of the projects related to creating jobs, securing social benefits, and bridging digital divide. We believe that the UNDP should keep leading by example on implementing operational and result-oriented projects. Poverty eradication and development assistance should remain at the core of UNDP work. As the administrator rightfully mentioned in the written statement, problems that have been exacerbated with COVID-19 existed for years, and it's in our hands as an international community to unite our forces and find ways to pull the world out of the crisis. One of the main principles that should guide us is adherence to the SDGs and their integral character. Mr. President, the report on structured funding dialogue mentions that in 2019, UNDP streamlined 150 processes and saved around $18 million, as well as balanced its institutional budget for the third consecutive year. We welcome this trend and commend UNDP efforts on increasing the efficiency in its work. As for the UNDS reform, we are concerned that as a result of some processes, UNDP was deprived of direct access to key partners in its mandated areas. We are sure that such situations are detrimental to the United Development activities, and we are willing to engage in finding ways to prevent this from happening in future. Mr. President, one of UNDP's strong advantages is that it has a wide and diverse donor and partner base. In this regard, we would like to urge UNDP to broaden its cooperation with international financial institutions, including the World Bank Group, for the benefit of countries in conflict situations. Mr. President, Russia is determined to take part in the preparations of the next strategic plan, which should be balanced and based on UNDP's core mandate. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative, deputy permanent representative of Russia. And I now give the floor to the deputy permanent representative of Korea, the Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Administrator, for your comprehensive update on the work of the UNDP. I'd like to join you in thanking departing senior members for their dedicated service and time-honored commitment to the spirit of the UN. I would also like to express my appreciation for the tireless efforts of all staff members to deliver support and solutions uninterrupted by the pandemic. My delegation agrees with Mr. Steiner on your assessment of the current situation and the best way forward during the unprecedented times. We particularly welcome and support the UNDP COVID-19 offer, where the focus has been placed on 4 areas, including the green economy. It is noteworthy that this offer is fully informed by the lessons learned over the past month and the results of a socio-economic impact assessment. In our own national effort to recover better and greener, Korea has announced a recovery package entitled Korean New Deal that centers around 3 key pillars, namely Digital New Deal, Green New Deal, and reinforced social safety nets. The Korean New Deal in particular pursues low carbon economy through systematic investment in key sectors and green job creation. Leveraging our own recovery efforts in close partnership with the UNDP, Korea will continue its contributions towards a resilient and sustainable recovery for all. My delegation fully shares the concerns about financing challenges that will be aggravated by the economic downturn. Despite the fiscal constraints imposed by the response to the COVID-19, Korea will make extra efforts to maintain the level of our committed contribution to core resources. However, I would like to highlight the necessity to diversify the funding base in order to sustainably respond to funding challenges. I believe that the continued efforts to partner with the private sector and explore innovative financing are crucial in the COVID-19 era and beyond. In this connection, I'd like to hear UNDP's plan to engage further with the private sector and its responses in mitigating related risks. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of the Republic of Korea, and I now give the floor to the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of Ireland. You have the floor, Ireland, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, Ambassador Webson. Thank you for bringing us together this morning. And thank you, Mr. Administrator Achim, for your wide-ranging and thoughtful remarks, and also for your responses to questions so far. Ireland commends the UNDP for its continued progress in delivering on its strategic plan against the backdrop of significant transition due to the ongoing UN reform process and the COVID-19 pandemic, which has created a new reality for all of us. And I want to join others in paying tribute to the commitment and dedication that UNDP staff have shown in these very challenging times. I had a number of questions, Mr. President, but a lot has been covered already. So in the interest of time, I'll just stick to one follow-up. The COVID-19 pandemic, amongst other aspects of our work here at the UN, is undermining peace support efforts in many conflict-affected and fragile contexts. How is the UNDP working with national governments, the UN, and other multilateral organizations and civil society partners in these situations to respond to COVID-19 and to protect peace-building efforts? Thank you again, Mr. President, and just to underline Ireland's steadfast commitment to working with the UNDP in the period ahead. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of Ireland, and at this time I will return to the Administrator for response to the several comments and or questions. Mr. Steiner, please.
Thank you very much, President. And I'll, with your permission, invite also Murad in a moment, perhaps to comment on the aspects of the humanitarian development peace nexus. I think both in earlier questions, but also to Brian Flynn's remarks just now, I think, yes, we have indeed some very, I think, relevant and valuable experiences to share from our work in Yemen, in Libya, Central African Republic, contexts where COVID has come on top of you know, great dysfunctionality and stress. And I think we do want to share with you some of those lessons. So Murad, if you could be ready in a moment, but I'll just briefly go back to the remarks by the Deputy Permanent Representative of Japan. We certainly value very much the dialogue that we have had with you directly, and also the engagement when Japan stepped forward just a few months ago with additional financing earmarked for 29 countries in a supplementary budget of 69 million for a COVID response and related work. And I think your question was to some extent how can earmarked contributions and non-earmarked or core contributions complement each other. I think in one sense it's a pragmatic question. One can always leverage and enhance the capacity to operate. I would begin by simply saying an institution that is only earmark funded is not an institution that can develop a strategy or an accountability or indeed optimize its impact. It is in the combination of core financing that provides the core capacity, the agility to respond, that the value of then transacting also that institution's platform for earmarked financing comes to its true optimal value. I often think of UNDP also when you take the vertical funds as being an institution that, because of its core competence as a development institution with an SDG integrated approach to looking at interventions, for example, in responding to climate or environment financing, GEF, GCF financing, we are a partner to countries in designing projects or investment proposals that the international community then through these funds invests in. And I think that facilitation combines both the institutional capacity and competence, the trust we enjoy on the part of the country, but also our ability to leverage additional international finance into domestic priorities. And there you see UNDP would not be able to do it if it was simply a consultancy company that was brought in to help develop a GCF proposal. And I think we will always have to struggle, and certainly I think we all agree that the ratio of core to non-core right now is unhealthy. The institution is underfunded in its core capacity, competence, and therefore also ability to deliver on the strategic value and the mandate that it is given. At the same time, constraining it in its ability to be a very useful partner on earmarked funding. Earmarked funding in itself is not a bad thing. It's a more targeted, it's a more focused form of collaboration, but it is in the ratio that I think we need to look for optimization. But in principle, there is nothing that prevents good complementarity from being a driving force for that funding. Just a brief additional remark to Japan's point about is the offer 2.0 a precursor to the next strategic plan? I would not wish to signal that right now, although I would not be surprised at some key elements in the response to COVID-19 and how they correlate to the 2030 agenda and the SDGs will find expression through some of the more focused priorities and choices that countries need to make. The reason why we put the offer 2.0 forward is that the feedback from countries was so clearly beginning to signal that you can't have everything right now. Therefore, governments have to make choices and priorities. Governance emerged as a very clear request to UNDP because we are in the international community a core reference and partner for decades. And the centrality of the state to be able to be functional, but also of some of the normative elements of how we manage through this crisis clearly are at the forefront of virtually every country. Similarly, social protection, inequality, leaving no one behind, that confluence of objectives and capacities is where UNDP is a great connector of best practices. We are learning 24/7 right now, not in our own little laboratory, but in the laboratories that countries are having to essentially stand up overnight to cope with this situation, but then connecting it. And this is the great connector role of UNDP. On the green economy, I think, however it will articulate itself, there is no question that the climate challenge, but not only the climate challenge, the loss of biodiversity, the impact on ecosystems, on our food security, these are issues which every country in one form or another through public pressure, through the empirical and scientific evidence has to factor into the DNA of how to move forward. UNDP's expression of a green economy priority within this COVID response to link short-term crisis management to longer-term recovery and moving forward is precisely giving the opportunity. One country may call it green jobs. We need to think about livelihoods. Where do our people get back to being able to work, whether it's in the rural economy on the land, whether it is in the urban economy? That transition and transformation is a key element that we can bring to national development planning and choice making. And digital disruption, I do not need to say more. I think UNDP, I am very proud of, is today an institution with a chief digital officer, a rapidly expanded digital team, and an extraordinary network of, and we're tracking right now 190 digital innovations and programs across the program countries we are working in order to make them accessible to countries who literally overnight have to make billion-dollar choices sometimes in where to leverage or address the inequality of the current digital economy. So I do not wish to in any way foreshadow that this is a blueprint for the next strategic plan, but key elements of what we now see, I think, will find their way into the discourse and dialogue that all of you are looking for. And, you know, to Russia's comments also on how we look at the next strategic plan, I think it is both in a smart, strategic way, trying to continue what I saw as so critical in the current strategic plan. The license to experiment, the ability of UNDP to embrace innovation as a core function of its work in partnership with local government and private sector and civil society and academia partners, those are driving forces that I think will shape the plan, not so much the individual subjects, because they will vary from country to country. A number of comments were made also on CPDs and UNDAPs, and I will simply say we have fully embraced the General Assembly decision. We have read it carefully, and we have instructed our resident representatives and country teams to work with the UN country team, with the resident coordinator, and where a UNSCDF is available to ensure that our CPD is aligned. I remind you that we are still in the midst of a reform where we are trying to align the timetable of national UNDAFs into UNSCDFs. There will be some adjustment period, but wherever a UNSCDF, even if it is not yet signed off, but is essentially completed, it first of all has been done with UNDP contributions. Not a single country I can point to where that would not be the case. Secondly, in the development of our CPD, both with our national government authority partners, but also with our partners, broadly speaking, that CPD is aligned with the UNSCDF. So I think on our end, we have, first of all, no hesitation that in your capacity as board members, you are absolutely right that you need to be able to assess whether a CPD is aligned with the UNSCDF. It is not the board's and it is not my responsibility on how the UNSCDF is in the end ultimately delivered. That is a conversation that is certainly with DCO and the resident coordinators, one that you as member states may have. We in the UN family certainly are absolutely engaged every day at country level in this discussion. The UK mentioned another number of points, and if you allow me, James, I will reply to them because they are quite detailed in the written response that the President asked me to put forward. But certainly the overall response is affirmative, and Murad in a moment will also pick up on the coordination, collaboration, for example, between the Global Humanitarian Response Plan, the MPTF, and in the way that we combine the different capacities and responses of the UN system when you spoke to our next strategic plan, peace, climate, environment nexus. If I may just say a couple of words about finance. We all have to accept that this is going to be a challenging period. I absolutely have done and given great priority to making UNDP a more contemporary partner to governments in understanding the role of the private sector, in making UNDP being able to contribute to a greater engagement of the private sector in the 2030 agenda, to allow the international community in its financing partnerships with countries, for example, through the UNFPA work, to better understand how these different financial flows can be aligned. We have even reached out, and Korea is in fact a good example, since our colleague raised this issue of sustainable financing in the private sector, amongst others. of our partnership with Samsung. Over 40 million new Galaxy phones now carry the SDG app on these new phones, enabling people to engage on the SDGs, to raise funding. And this is a great success story that we have put in place as an illustration of not trying to do something that I want to caution all of us. The private sector cannot become an alternative funder of a public institution and of the United Nations system. It can co-invest, it can bring its assets, we can use technology platforms. But the minute that a public institution like UNDP sells itself, so to speak, into a corporate logic for alternative financing, it risks its legitimacy, its accountability, and therefore I view these partnerships always as not being an alternative to the UNDP financial business model, but rather to complement, to enhance, to open up co-investment opportunities. And indeed, in a few weeks' time, we will announce another major partnership around the Accelerator Lab, since you asked the question, which I very much look forward to. But the private sector and the public institutional roles are always distinct. But in the way that we work with governments, we are absolutely focused on how to maximize the scope for the private sector to play its part. I remind you again of SDG Impact, which is exclusively looking at leveraging additional finance domestically and internationally through the private sector in alignment with the purpose of the SDGs, but aimed at helping governments being able to do that. Murad, maybe if I could turn to you for perhaps a brief reflection also on the humanitarian development peace nexus and some of our work in conflict countries, which a number of our ambassadors raised.
Thank you very much. And with your permission, Mr. President, perhaps I'll take just 2 minutes on an attempt at a response. Anyway, at the policy level and in terms of guidance to UN country teams, UNDP and PBSO have co-led a guidance note that is going to all country teams only last week, that would prioritize conflict sensitivity and vulnerability assessment in all of our impact assessments and indeed in our response plans as a country team. So we're working very much within a UN country team context in terms of a peace development nexus in this area. In terms of a more broad humanitarian peace and development nexus, perhaps I could highlight our efforts in the Sahel, and specifically in the Liptako-Gourma and Lake Chad Basin areas, where through an emphasis on local governance, but also the provision of jobs and livelihoods for youth, we are attempting to support stability, in particular for disadvantaged population groups, women and youth, but also internally displaced, and working very much within a humanitarian response plan in this area. A third and perhaps last example, if I may be allowed, and one which has just occurred now, is the signature last week of an agreement between UNDP and the European Union in Yemen for 69 million euro, viewing an attempt at strengthening local governance mechanisms to support livelihoods, job creation, but also the delivery of services, both health and education, for the local population, but also for the internally displaced. I could go on, but Mr. President, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steiner and colleague. Thank you for your responses. We will now invite the distinguished delegate from Mexico. So the next 3 speakers would be Mexico, Peru, and the United States of America. And then we'll take a few more that we have already lined up. So I'll now invite the distinguished delegate of Mexico, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. And Mexico also thanks Administrator Steiner for his leadership. We would like to highlight the effectiveness of UNDP response to the pandemic and the implementation of its strategic plan. The program has contributed to increase the financial stability and efficiency in the use of resources, while investing in more development programs and services. Mexico acknowledges that UNDP has highlighted the importance of the development aspects of the crisis, especially in the long term. So far, UNDP has published 3 reports in Mexico about the human development, socioeconomic and health challenges related to the impact of COVID in Mexico. Mexico is grateful for the recommendations provided by UNDP in these publications that are guiding our response to the COVID challenge. Let me also reaffirm our strong support to UNDP's strategic plan and recognize its commitment to the reform of the UN development system, as the administrator has highlighted. Mexico is among the first countries that has signed its United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework for the period 2020-2025. This reaffirms our commitment to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and overall to the United Nations new development system. We believe this instrument will foster UN development activities at country level that focuses on human rights, gender equality, the visibility and attention to the most vulnerable groups, and on the relevance. To conclude, Mr. President, Mexico stands together with UNDP as we seek to build back better. This requires more cooperation, coordination, and solidarity. Working together is the only possible way to prepare, respond, and to overcome the challenges toward 2030. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Mexico, and I give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Peru. You have the floor, please, Peru.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to welcome the convening of this important interactive dialogue and start by thanking Administrator Achim Steiner for his leadership and hard work during this pandemic, as well as for his comprehensive presentation. Peru values UNDP's work in our country and the projects and actions it has been carrying out before COVID-19, as well as those developed in response to the pandemic and its economic and social impact, particularly for the benefit of the most vulnerable and targeted groups to overcome development gaps. We are particularly worried about the fact that 2 out of 3 COVID-19 deaths are happening in developing countries. The impact on inequality among and within countries, as well as the devastating effects it is having on states with a high number of informal workers who lack social protections, as has been touched by the administrator. In that regard, we would like to highlight the UNDP COVID-19 offer and the recuperation and response plan for Peru, as presented by the UNCT, which is framed within and has considered national policies and main strategic plans, including the Peruvian National Accord, the Vision for Development towards 2050, and advances by the Center for National Strategic Planning of Peru, among other national guiding policy frameworks. Having mentioned that, we share the view that the UNDS reform has shown positive impacts. We are keenly aware of the challenges faced in this restructuring process, and note that this has to be done with harmony and tact in a situation that was not foreseen and which has accentuated the problems of inequality, poverty, and others at the global level. And in that context, find ways to articulate such coordination with countries' objectives and priorities to be able to rebuild better our social economic structures in alignment with the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda. Finally, I would like to emphasize the need to enhance cooperation, solidarity, and reaffirm the importance of multilateralism. The current crisis has highlighted the many deficiencies in our social and economic structures, but it has also given us the opportunity to revalue the importance of collaboration in finding common solutions to common problems. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Mexico, and I will now invite the distinguished delegate of Guatemala. Take the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. And thank you also for Mr. Steiner for his remarks and updates, and for describing so vividly the many actions and initiatives taken by UNDP to contribute to global efforts to recover better from the COVID-19 pandemic and reach the SDGs in this decade of action. At the national level, we appreciate the immense efforts made by UNDP through its many support areas and recent virtual country visit led by the Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean that only strengthened our commitment to work together and achieve our common goals. Like others, we're struggling to mitigate the negative socioeconomic effects of the pandemic while simultaneously addressing the immediate health crisis. One of our concerns is how to break the pervasive systemic vicious cycles that perpetuate poverty, food insecurity, and malnutrition that represent a complex development problem requiring structural changes at the global and national levels. The root causes of these problems must be tackled in a coordinated and coherent manner with all relevant stakeholders. So allow me in this vein to ask a few questions. As we begin preparations for the World Food System Summit in 2021, where the lead, I understand, for planning and coordination will be taken by the Rome-based agencies, what role do you envision for UNDP, and where is its added value to contribute to these discussions? Of course, food security and nutrition is related to all three dimensions of sustainable development. And as UNDP is a global thought leader on these issues, we certainly would be interested in how UNDP views these upcoming global discussions on the matter. And related to that, we're quite interested in the example you used in your written remarks on a project in Timor-Leste, where UNDP is implementing funding from a regional development bank with support from Japan to help the government address food security in the most vulnerable areas with food from local farmers. So how can we learn more about this and share some experiences from those projects? And finally, a follow-up question on your points on the private sector. Do you foresee a paradigm shift in the way the private sector plans and operates? From our experience, any change in behavior occurs when an actor reacts to different incentives and incentive structures. So does UNDP or does the broader UN system have a role in helping to shape and align these incentives so that we can fulfill the SDGs through all these partnerships, including the private sector? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Guatemala. And I will now give the floor to the distinguished delegate from the United States of America, who will be followed by the distinguished delegates from Germany and Cuba. The United States of America, you have the floor, please. The United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Administrator Steiner, for your updates on UNDP's assistance to developing countries coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. As you pointed out, the pandemic is a test case for UNDP's capacities to deliver on its mandate in extraordinary circumstances. And I want to add our voice to those who have expressed deep appreciation to UNDP staff worldwide. And we also want to recognize UNDP's ability to marshal resources and expertise with alacrity to meet the needs in the field. We also appreciate the administrator's brief update on the work of UNDP's audit and evaluation functions, particularly his attention to their work regarding the vertical fund projects. We are following this work with a great interest and look forward to regular updates on the independent review. Mr. President, a few quick words on the funding dialogue, which is an important topic for this agenda item. The United States has been the largest contributor to UNDP's core resources during the past 5 years. In 2019, the United States contribution amounted for approximately 13% of total core contributions. We increased our 2020 pledge by 2% and encourage other member states to continue to increase their core funding. The United States welcomes UNDP's efforts to accelerate results on the ground and to continue to improve results-based management and budgeting to ensure resource plans and allocations are closely linked to intended and demonstrated program results at the country level. We encourage UNDP to continue to coordinate and lead joint activities with other UN development system agencies, particularly in areas of its core competency, such as governance, rule of law, crisis prevention, and recovery. We would welcome more examples of this collaboration and its impact on the ground in UNDP's future reporting to the board. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States of America, and I give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Germany. You have the floor, please, Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first of all, let me relay warm regards from our DPR Günther Sauter, who had planned to be here for this occasion. I would like to join others in thanking the Administrator Steiner and all UNDP staff for your commitment and your leadership in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. As you noted in your statement, half of the world's population does not have access to social protection system, and mitigating the impact of the pandemic on human development and the world's poor is indeed a colossal task. In our view, a crisis of such global proportions is not a time to hunker down. It is a time to stand together in solidarity across borders. It is in this spirit that I'm pleased to announce that Germany will contribute an additional 50 million euros of core funding to support UNDP's COVID response this year, more than doubling our core contribution to 110 million euros, around $100 million. With this contribution, we want to support efforts to build back better, focusing on a fair, inclusive, and green recovery. And I would also like to pose a question in this regard. UNDP has been the technical lead for socio-economic recovery under the Common UN Framework. And we would appreciate more information on how the idea of a green recovery has been implemented in the socio-economic impact assessments and response plans prepared so far, your lessons learned. Once again, we would like to thank UNDP and you, Administrator Steiner, for your leadership on the global response to COVID-19, and you can count on Germany's continued support. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany, and I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Cuba. Cuba, you have the floor, please. Cuba, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And I want also to thank other delegations who have expressed their appreciation for the commitment and all the efforts done by UNDP and particularly by UNDP Administrator, Mr. Steiner, especially during this trying time, as well as for all the documentation that has been provided for this particular session, particularly the updates on the implementation of the UNDP's response on the repositioning of the UNDS, as well as everything related with the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Allowed me also to thank members of the Bureau and yourself, Ambassador Wilson, for all the work in bringing about this second regular session, which is taking place in the midst of very complex circumstances. Many of our countries, particularly developing countries, have seen drastically reduce the resources needed to fight the COVID-19 pandemic and invest in the recovery. And in this regard, we very much appreciate UNDP's efforts to provide a globally coordinated and comprehensive response in addressing and recovering from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. In that regard, we highly appreciate all the support offered by UNDP to Cuba in response to the COVID-19, which we appreciate has helped to strengthen our capacity to respond to the control and recovery from the effects of the current pandemic. In light of this year celebration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, this crisis brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, we believe is also, however, an opportunity for a stronger international cooperation, greater solidarity, and a strengthening of multilateralism at all levels among all our countries. And in this regard, we believe that UNDP plays and will play an essential role in this regard. Together, the international community can share best practices and learn from best experiences, exchange knowledge, goods, technologies, strengthen cooperation in technical assistance and capacity building, among other areas, and generally view public health as a global public good. We further believe that South-South and triangular cooperation can significantly contribute to our collective fight against the current pandemic and to the path to recovery of our economies and societies. It is precisely in this spirit of solidarity and international cooperation that Cuba has already sent 45 medical brigades that have collaborated in over 39 different countries and territories to help all these specific countries and populations in the fight against the pandemic. And this is our modest efforts in the current global fight against COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, we would appreciate if further elements could be provided on the strategy developed by UNDP in order to be able to deal with the decrease in core resources, including in the context of the current pandemic, taking into account that this constitutes the pillar of the operational activity of the United Nations and the main guarantee for properly addressing the needs and priorities of recipient countries. I would like to conclude by reiterating my delegation's commitment to strengthening the ties of cooperation between UNDP and Cuba. I thank you. Thank you so much.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Cuba, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of El Salvador. El Salvador, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, apologies on behalf of Ambassador Lopez, who unforeseen circumstances restrained her for deliver this statement. Also, would like to thank the UNDP administrator for his presentation on the findings of the report. We welcome all the work that UNDP has done on the ground, particularly their constant and reliable support throughout the wave of negative effects caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The health crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly put the United Nations system's capacity for action and reaction to the test, and specifically its agencies, funds, and offices. The pandemic that we have faced since the beginning of March 2020 has exacerbated the needs, increased the vulnerability, and tested the resilience of the inhabitants of countries around the world. In April 2020, El Salvador was one of the Latin American countries selected as beneficiary of the Rapid Response Fund to COVID-19, launched by UNDP, which includes support for the country under 3 pillars: preparedness, response, and recovery. In this regard, The government of El Salvador welcomes the UNDP initiative to support the country in different stages through said fund, as well as UNFPA in this matter. We also would like to highlight the evident progress made in recent years by the agencies to position the issue of gender equality, particularly from UNDP and UNFPA. Undoubtedly, balancing the investment budgets in the territory with specific percentages destined to these vulnerable groups has important impacts on our national reality. With regards to the topic of the work and activities of middle-income countries, we would like to highlight the fact that the support towards these countries should not be a matter of political debate. El Salvador, as a country in such category, can definitely speak of all the challenges that are faced in many different areas, and how the support of the UN system, including UNDP, is still crucial in the achievement of sustainable development. We appreciate the fact that UNDP has pioneered the assessment of indexes that include measurements beyond the GDP per capita to evaluate countries, and we strongly believe such practice should be exported to other UN agencies. And also, it is heavily encouraged to be incorporated into the decision-making processes at the international financial institutions, particularly those categorizations made with the purpose of assigning support to developing countries. The reason for this is because GDP per capita measures only one aspect of the three pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, and therefore avoids assessing the entire spectrum of challenges or achievements in a particular country. We reaffirm the commitment of the government of El Salvador with these agencies to move forward in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, together with its objectives, goals, and indicators. Their support is decisive to be able to advance firmly in their fulfillment, particularly now that we are on the threshold of the decade of action. Finally, we look forward to the close cooperation with UNDP as a reliable partner in the efforts by the government of El Salvador to address the challenges faced by the COVID-19 pandemic, and in the process of implementing the Agenda 2030 with its SDG in a timely manner. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of El Salvador, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy. Italy, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to present the greetings of Ambassador Zapia, who cannot be here today for conflicting commitments. We wish to thank, first of all, the Administrator Steiner for his very comprehensive statement, which has given us an effective picture of the current interconnected and integrated challenges for sustainable development in this unprecedented COVID-19 world. We commend the work so far carried out by UNDP on many levels: rapid response, swift coordination with partnering agencies, effective procurement services, proximity to member states, and direct support. UNDP, together with other key UN agencies, funds, and programs, is at the forefront of the COVID response. This crisis accelerated the needs for effective implementation of integrated development solutions and require an unprecedented multidimensional response to the direct and indirect challenges of the pandemic. UNDP has the responsibility, the capacity, and the opportunity to play a key role in all areas, and we must work all together, faster and better, to improve program effectiveness in order to address needs. From this point of view, it is crucial to fully implement the humanitarian development peace nexus. Italy stands ready to continue supporting you, as we have recently done by securing our core contribution and approving 3 new initiatives just over the last 2 months, respectively in Afghanistan, Jordan, and Sudan, focusing on key areas such as resilience building, social inclusion and protection, women and youth empowerment. As you highlighted, Mr. Administrator, in your statement, Italy has also been a front-runner in the financing of the UNDP Lab Network, which is now providing innovative solutions implemented in many countries. Additionally, we continue our work together on the fundamental aspect of climate change, resilience, and environment, a qualifying aspect of our partnership. Mr. Administrator, Italy will continue to strongly support the multilateral development cooperation system, as we did in building up the COVID-19 global response as co-leads in the sectors of global health, food security, and in sustaining multidimensional responses. We encourage UNDP to continue developing effective partnership within the UNDS system and beyond in order to ensure greater efficiency and effectiveness, as well as value added and maximizing impact. As we approach 2021, Italy stands ready to working with you to ensure and steer the global sustainable response and recovery from the pandemic and development crisis, especially as incoming G20 presidency and in the framework of our partnership with the UK on the COP26. And I would like to point out a couple of questions relating to the activities that UNDP is going to carry out in the next future. We are very interested in knowing how UNDP intends to maximize the limited resources that we all have in this moment, and especially implementing stronger partnership with all actors of the UN development system and in general the international community. We are also interested in knowing how are you going to work in the framework of the actual UN global funds like the GHDRP, SPRP, and in cooperation with international financial institutions, especially the World Bank. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We can now hear a statement by the European Union. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. The EU as a donor would like to refer to its written statement posted on the portal. We would just like to highlight here one of the areas of the EU's close collaboration with UNDP, and that is in its capacity as technical lead within the UN development system side on the socio-economic response to COVID-19. One of the key areas of interventions in the Team Europe response to COVID-19, which combines resources from the European Union and its member states, with funding standing at more than now 36 billion euros. Our collaboration with UNDP includes joint socioeconomic impact assessments in many countries. Moreover, COVID-19 recovery needs assessments are now being rolled out in Cape Verde, Ecuador, El Salvador, Mozambique, and Haiti, as highlighted by the administrator. We value the competent support UNDP is providing to the Financing for Development thematic group on recovering better for sustainability, which is co-chaired by Fiji, Rwanda, the UK, and the EU. We know that time is getting short, but maybe the administrator could go a bit more into UNDP's role at the level of cooperation at this Financing for Development and international financial institutions. And lastly, COVID-19 has also increased the importance and urgency of some of the existing cooperation between UNDP and the European Union. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. And I think that ends the list of speakers. So I will ask Mr. Steiner and his team to respond, to comment, and to make any closing comments. Akim, you have the floor again with your team, please.
Thank you, President. As always, there are many illustrations of the issues we are discussing that benefit from perhaps a little bit of storytelling, as we often say. And I perhaps just want to ask Luis Felipe, because there was an interesting remark that our colleague David Mallet made about virtual country visits. Maybe Luis Felipe, in a moment, I'll turn to you. And if you allow me, perhaps I will give some very brief responses now, President, perhaps invite the regional directors to offer just a couple of reflections on their region also, because I think we have a little bit of time, unless you want to finish before 1, because it takes us to the reality of where we are. But the risk is obviously that we can take too long. So please guide me in whether you want to finish earlier than we may curtail it and just ask 1 or 2. Sorry, you're on mute, President, sorry. you're still on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. So we are not aiming to finish earlier. So, but just that we keep the comments within the time frame, sort of thing.
Very good.
Okay.
I'll be very quick in just picking up on some of the specific remarks that were made. Mexico, Peru, Guatemala, but also Cuba and El Salvador spoke to, you know, sometimes it's not a project, it's the more intangible advice that we can provide. And I think one of the very gratifying experiences from our work over the last few months has been the very direct access that we have to our government counterparts, but also how presidents, prime ministers, ministers feel that they can call on UNDP very directly, invite our regional directors or request experts, or for us to bring some international expertise, or from another country, and a national expert who can share how a national cash transfer program was set up. And I think we are very quickly learning that this notion of the global policy network, that connector function that I have spoken to as part of this transformation of UNDP, has really received a boost through COVID-19, both in practical terms, but also in us learning how and where we need to invest. We spent from many different angles this morning touching on the issue of financing and funding. And let me repeat that I want to, first of all, echo your preoccupation with this topic in a positive sense, and also in a how do we manage a difficult time that may lie ahead for us. First of all, on the diversification of funding, I have not in the speech, I have done so, but here I have constrained myself. But let me also recognize, first of all, to our colleague from the United States, let me acknowledge that indeed the United States has been the single largest core contributor to UNDP. Although, Charles, I'm sorry that it is that I have to bear the news. Germany has now overtaken you, but what we want is a race to the top and not to the bottom. So the last few years, the United States has indeed been and maintained that core funding that has been so crucial to providing UNDP with the stability to move forward. In addition to which, obviously on non-core funding, again, the United States is amongst the top contributors to UNDP. We have also seen a renewal of another partnership that began a few years ago and I think has proved very steadfast, and it is a kind of programmatic support. It's the Russia UNDP Trust Fund, which was renewed this year and is an instrument which is not precisely core funding, but is very flexible. It identifies a number of countries around the world, but allows UNDP to work with the country to develop measures that are in line with national priorities, where the Russia UNDP Trust Fund becomes a vehicle for financing. And again, I want to thank Russia for renewal. I also want to mention Algeria, which in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis contributed funding to UNDP in part to show its expression of appreciation, but also its realization of how important UNDP's work was for the African continent also in the midst of this COVID crisis. So we are seeing, first of all, very stable core donors, our Nordic partners, the Netherlands, Italy, we just heard about, and the UK, clearly providing that vital backbone to UNDP. My greatest worry right now is that because of domestic pressures, we will see a stepping back from these commitments when indeed we know that they are in need of stepping forward. And this is my greatest preoccupation. How can we help citizens in countries in Europe, in Japan, in the United States and other OECD nations realize what little amount of money, in fact, they are being asked to contribute to that common promise, and how many multipliers there are to it. And we are still not managing to do this very well. Whether we call it results-based management, as some of you say, yes, but we also have to realize not everything that makes a multilateral investment resonate at home is measured in the way that we transact in our bureaucracies and in our administrations. We have to touch on something that is essentially more able to bind us together. That's why I have asked and spoken a great deal in the last few weeks about generational projects. the ability to conceive out of this COVID-19 crisis an opportunity to cut in half the number of people without access to electricity, particularly on the African continent. It is perfectly doable. It is perfectly financeable. It would be the greatest development boost and economic stimulus for the poorest of the poor. This is a kind of generational project around which the public in donor countries can also rally. Nobody likes to forgive debt and to write off debts and to transact in those terms. I also want to point to two other examples that speak to this kind of generational effort. In India, the proposal to connect 450,000 villages in the next 1,000 days to fiber optic, in addition to the 150,000, if I have the numbers correct, that are already connected. That is the kind of response that is needed. If you look to Pakistan and its ability to stand up in a matter of a few weeks, a cash transfer program reaching well over 12 million households, 70 million people using digital and other data sets in order to do something that has never been done for in the history of the country. I could go to Togo, to Honduras, the Dominican Republic, many other countries, Brazil, using its social welfare and social security infrastructure in order to be able to stabilize the livelihoods of millions and millions of people. We are learning a great deal about what capital we have in our economies and in our societies, but also the opportunities that are there. But financing goes beyond that. And indeed, 3 sectors in the private sector, I think, will be central to expanding the scope for investing and leveraging private sector finance into SDG outcomes. The insurance sector, the finance sector, and the digital sector, 3 sectors with which UNDP is in very intense contact. You may recall I co-chair the Insurance Development Forum at the moment with leading insurance companies, the World Bank, and other public partners. We are heavily engaged with the finance sector through SDG Impact, and Mexico most recently was a country that launched a new SDG bond in which we were able to contribute with our expertise. The SDG mapping that we are doing right now in 12 countries to look at how private sector investment opportunities aligned with public purpose priorities can be used to attract private capital is another illustration. We are working very actively at the interface of governments and private and public finance and how markets can align themselves. And I think therein lies the paradigm shift that I think it was David Mallet who spoke to that. There is a paradigm shift in the private sector. First of all, in the crisis, recognizing the centrality of government, state institutions and their functional and business continuity, but also the increasing expectation that the private sector is in part defined in its future orientation in how it can contribute to addressing the challenge of climate change or food security. And here very briefly, just to acknowledge, and I'll provide more in the written response, on the World Food Summit, UNDP is actively engaged. We are part of the task force for the Food System Summit. We ourselves have worked and launched a 10-year strategy and practice on food and agricultural commodity systems since July. And again, it is the integrated mandate here. We have our Rome-based agencies. We have the FAO. It is not for UNDP to become a food production-focused entity, but food production is not just seeds and land and fertilizer and water. It is the rural market economy. It is the infrastructure. Food loss in Brazil is as much a function of not having storage capacity as part of the national infrastructure as it is that the transport system also doesn't reach the last mile. And so Brazil has an extraordinary loss of food production as a result of these 2 factors in which the private sector could play a very central role, but only if government provides the right incentives. So with these remarks, if you allow me, President, may I invite Luis Felipe, and perhaps I could suggest also Kani as 2 regional directors to briefly comment from their perspective and then come back to you.
Yes, please, Akim. But a very important question asked by, I think, Guatemala with regards to lessons learned. You might, either you or one of the colleagues might speak to that. Lessons learned from the Timor-Leste project.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Kani, hopefully, I know you are regional director only since 5-6 months for the region, but perhaps you might be able to respond. Over to you. Well, Luis Felipe and then Kani, if I may.
Thank you, Administrator, and with your permission, Mr. President. First of all, I want to thank the ambassadors for their statements, particularly those from the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, and for the trust to UNDP, because we have been engaging at the highest level. Certainly, we have felt how much our counterparts trust our teams, and our teams have been working 24/7 to be at the level required for this challenge. So very briefly on the issue that the administrator mentioned, indeed, we tested, we wanted to reinitiate our missions, but of course it cannot be with physical presence. So we tested this modality of a virtual mission, and we decided to do it in Guatemala because we had promised to the government that we're going to be there for a discussion on a few very important projects. So we did exactly what we would do in a regular mission, all the protocols, and we ended up having 2.5 very intense days in which I had the opportunity, very generously, the president of Guatemala actually discussed with us, the challenges for the country and how UNDP could help Guatemala for almost an hour. We also had the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Finance, Minister of the Environment, Minister of the Economy, Social Development, the Mayor of Guatemala City. I met with the full UNDP staff in Guatemala, with the Staff Association, and also in my role as chair of the UNSDG LAC, also met with the UN country team. And also had a very, very, very productive discussion with 15 representatives of the private sector in Guatemala. So it was really a very, very productive mission. I reported back to the administrator, not only in terms of the content, but also in terms of the savings, the financial savings, and the savings or the balance in terms of carbon emissions that were saved because of this modality. Finally, just to close, of course, there are elements of the physical presence that make a mission different. So I would not envisage having only virtual missions in the future, but certainly it has been now tested that this can be a very effective manner to be close to our counterparts and to have these important conversations. We envisage is potentially a strategic combination of physical presence and virtual missions in the future. Thank you, Administrator.
Thank you, Luis Felipe. Kani, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator, Mr. President. I would say that for us across the region, what we're seeing and the demand from the governments to us now, if I could encapsulate it, is to say there's just no going back to the old growth pathways where the rapid growth, but then you have to clean up pollution and inequalities after. And the biggest ask of UNDP is at this moment looking at what are those inclusive green recovery pathways with the policies, the investments, the institutional changes that would support, I would say, 3 key areas. One is testing, leveraging investments in renewables and really looking at the ecosystem for putting renewables at the heart of sustainable development. Second, the circular economy, and thank you to the representative of Guatemala to ask this, where you bring together the future of food and food production with the future of work. And how do you get young entrepreneurs to really focus on this? And some tremendous work going on both in land systems, but also marine ecology systems that are bringing the future of work and the future of food production together. So happy to discuss that also further with you. And the third area is this huge growing gap, which is caused by a digital economy that's still only for the few, and calling UNDP to help come in to look at much more access to digital means, both for better social protection, but also for to allow SMEs to really thrive in this environment, which is going to be with us for a long while to come. I'll stop there, Akim, and back to you.
Thank you very much. President, if I may just turn to AHUNA also, I mean, it's the continent with the largest number of countries. It straddles 2 bureaus. Just a couple of reflections, because it is in Africa that we have seen the frontier of some of the most dramatic responses to COVID, but also some of the most brutal impacts. AHUNA, would you perhaps offer a couple of reflections on what we as UNDP see as happening next? Sorry, maybe our central technicians have not opened. Yeah, now you're on. You just came on, AHUNA, just press again. Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Achim, and also Mr. President, Excellencies. Thank you for your support for this continent and for UNDP in general. I have 3 points that I could contribute. One thing that is clear that we've learned on this crisis is the COVID crisis, is the importance of leadership and leading, of governance and governing. And it's been quite energizing to see how business continuity support to countries has really helped African countries to keep the immediate impact of COVID-19 at bay on their ability to lead. UNDP was able to deploy digital technology to support several government ministries and other essential services to continue business so that they would not themselves be compromised in terms of their health and their ability to lead. And we see, for instance, in a country like Uganda, 70% of government was able to operate virtually, therefore protecting that core leadership function. The second point has to do with what we are seeing is a rising appetite for democracy on the continent, despite this crisis. We have some 18 to 20 elections that are planned between this year and next year in several parts of Africa. And countries and citizens have basically insisted that these elections must go forward. And UNDP has played an important role in keeping the election agenda active, but also supporting countries to see how to protect their populations, the electorate, as they go out to exercise their democratic rights. So doing elections within this COVID era in a safe and fair environment, at the same time promoting important political dialogue that should take place. In CAR, for instance, we have deployed over 3,000 COVID agents for elections so that we can create the confidence in the populace that they can indeed safely cast their votes when the time comes. So how we keep the electoral agenda, the whole democracy agenda on track in the middle of this crisis has been an important milestone for UNDP and the partners. And in relation to that, recently we launched with the African Union the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security on the continent, which is starting to generate policy positions and directives to countries. The last point has to do with social protection, social capital, social cohesion. Very important that this crisis has been deployed in a way that states begin to see where their most vulnerable are, assess their situations and provide tools and instruments to reach them with a much needed safety net support. And this, I think, we are starting to deploy in ways that would endure in the future of building the social contract between state, society, but also social capital between people, and hopefully promoting social cohesion that eventually would drive down the potential for violence and conflict in many of the countries. I will end it there, Kim. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. President, for your leadership.
President, if I may just end by saying we don't have time, but in our Bureau of Arab States, there have been some exceptional challenges faced. Murad already spoke to it, countries in the midst of conflict, but also extraordinary innovation, and we will continue to share that with you. The same applies to our program partnerships with the countries in the Bureau of Europe and the Commonwealth, Arabic, where we have seen from Albania after the earthquake, but also in Serbia and then moving further east to Central Asia, presidents and prime ministers writing to the Secretary General in appreciation of the role that the UN team, but in particular also UNDP, has been able to play in the midst of this COVID crisis. And a lot of it points again to that ability at this critical juncture to be able to make choices on crisis response, but with an intelligent view to how these can already enable a recovery pathway, lay the groundwork. And I think our South-South cooperation ecosystem, I would call it today, has become as much part of drawing on this experience, breakthroughs and success stories. And one of the interesting things is when you look at digital finance today, fintech and that universe of digital disruption, the frontiers, the horizons of innovation are not confined at all to the traditional technology centers, Shenzhen, California. In fact, some of the most remarkable innovations are happening in developing countries, sometimes least developed countries, because that's where digital provides the greatest opportunity for transformation and for leapfrogging. And that is where UNDP is such an asset, I think, to be able to connect this frontier of experimentation. But as Ahuna pointed out just now, governance and the role of government and the centrality of the state in keeping a society and economy together has, I think, sharpened the focus also for why UNDP's work on governance in both the normative sense, but also in governance of these emerging new arenas. That digital ecosystem is not just something that can grow on the back of a technology-led revolution. If you want to make it inclusive, if you don't want it to become through algorithms and others, another way of defining entire population groups out of an economy, it is one that requires policy, regulatory frameworks, protecting against cybercrime, privacy and data, just as an illustration of how in the midst of the COVID response, where digital is such a central tool, we can already lay the groundwork for a more sustainable digital economy in which the private sector, technology, entrepreneurs, startups lead with opportunity, but the state is not scrambling. Just take cryptocurrencies as an example, where much of the developing world is struggling to even understand how the concentration of leadership in this area is, even in a corporate sense, limited to just a handful of major companies. And the G20 is struggling to understand how this can be managed in a stabilizing way for our financial system. I want to just end my remarks, President, if you allow me, by making a reference to the next strategic plan. We all know, and we will continue to monitor and report to you, how COVID-19 is impacting our ability to deliver on the current strategic plan. There will be deviations, there will be delays, but I think in the way the strategic plan was conceived, in its responsiveness and in its core areas where UNDP can contribute, we have not lost sight of what we set out to do, whether it is on the issue of climate, whether it is on gender. And here, let me say that while we are more constrained at the moment in working in the field, we are acutely aware of the very worrying increases in gender-based violence. And therefore, our work in all the COVID response projects right now has built in, as I mentioned, an explicit focus on gender. We continue to obviously focus on our own responsibility on sexual harassment, sexual exploitation. And I have reported in my speech on what the data shows to us, but also how much we remain focused on my responsibility as administrator, our responsibility as staff and managers of UNDP to deliver on the promise we made to our staff, to ourselves, to you, and to women all across the world. And that has been also a challenge for us in addressing racism and discrimination. It's another part of both a phenomenon that exists all around us, but also within us, in our institutions, in our business processes. And so I have opened a conversation in UNDP that is now being led by a group of staff in order to advise us on how we also work yet again on our aspiration to be an anti-racist organization, to be an organization that actively does not just not tolerate racism and discrimination, but sees itself very much at the forefront of being able to help countries, but also help ourselves be an example that others can either emulate or study or disagree with. And in a last point on the next strategic plan, President, a number of you have alluded to it, I thank the board for giving us the opportunity to first of all engage with you over the next few months in a very deliberate process of understanding what it is that will define that next period in which UNDP, the strategic plan, and US member states see the value proposition, but also to use it as an opportunity to look carefully at how the future of development cooperation, of aid is evolving. And I would encourage you to view that journey that we will walk together in arriving next September at a new strategic plan as an exploration of the future of development through the lens of UNDP, because it can be emblematic, but it can also be a platform on which to conceive of the future of some of the key drivers of this relationship between those who see multilateralism and the development rationale within multilateralism as a key part of what keeps us together. And UNDP, within the UN's 75th anniversary, is also a reminder that sometimes in the darkest hours of our lives, some of the greatest ideas and visions about the future are born. I think 2020 will be one of those years that history books will write about, both in terms of the trauma, but perhaps also with some of the boldest ideas that will allow us to move forward. And the United Nations, I'm deeply convinced, is absolutely central to that. Not in what it was, but in what it will be. And development belongs right in the heart of that. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Steiner for his remarks and for the really very interesting and enthralling morning. I thank the colleagues with Akim from the agency for their responses and sharing information. I thought we had a really engaging discussion. There were very interesting questions and comments. The feedback was very informative. And those questions that were unanswered, we will do the practice where Mr. Steiner and his team, Akim and the colleagues will provide written responses. But thank you so much for really a very, very good day and very well participative, very much so by colleagues. I wish to close the interactive dialogue this morning. Executive board action will be taken. So colleagues, distinguished participants, excellencies, I would like to inform the board that a draft decision on agenda item 7, UNDP structured funding dialogue, is being prepared, and we will revert to that on this item later in the agenda, and we will adopt the decision maybe tomorrow. I thank you for your consideration. Before adjourning the morning's meeting, I wish to remind all delegates that from 1 o'clock now through to 3 o'clock, 1 second, through to 3 o'clock, there will be an informal consultation on the draft decisions. We will reconvene this afternoon at 3 p.m. to continue the UNDP segment. With those words, my dear colleagues, excellencies, ambassadors, once again, I thank you all for your participation. The morning meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
President, thank you.